Hello and welcome. Today we are going to talk about Chapter 7, Painting. When it comes to painting, you can say that there's a strong connection between what people consider as art and the way we think about art in the Western world. You can say that whenever people think about painting, when we think about art, we're basically thinking the same thing. Some of the earliest cave paintings that were found were made using natural pigments to ground pigments in the 17th century. When it comes to painting, there are three main ingredients. First is the pigment. Pigment is particles of color that can be mixed to form paint. We also have the binder. The binder is the adhesive liquid of paint to combine pigment. And we also have a vehicle. And a vehicle is the liquid contents of paint. So just a recap, pigment is the actual material that creates the color. Binder is what is needed to keep the pigment together. And the vehicle is the liquid content. It's basically what makes the paint the material that it is. Its viscosity is basically a moisture that is very sticky. So all of the painting material are the same, but they differ depending on the type of paint. So when it comes to these different types of paint, I'm going to ask you guys to remember the characteristics of each one. So just to break down pigments a little bit more, they are usually in the form of fine powder. If you look at this example by Lita Albuquerque, the work is called Wind Painting, illustrating the dusty nature. And what the artist does here is she creates painting just from using the pigment itself in its powder form. What she does is she arranges her canvas on the ground somehow and say that it is a very windy day. She's just going to allow for the pigment to drop and fall on the canvas naturally. So you can say this is a very contemporary way to use painting as a medium, really just using the materials that are usually found in painting. So pigments are what is responsible when it comes to providing color. They try to use materials that can resist fading over time. When it comes to binders again, they are the material that holds the pigment particles together. An example of that would be in oil paint, where it has linseed oil and has a natural oil, and that keeps all of the color particles together. So vehicles make paint a liquid and can be further added for thinning. And when it comes to a vehicle for something like oil painting, they use turpentine. And turpentine is a very toxic material. It can make the paint thinner so that when they apply it on the canvas, you can actually control how thick or how thin the pigments may appear. So another example of a vehicle is water used in watercolors. So you're probably wondering why not just use water in oil painting? Well, maybe some of you already know that oil and water don't mix, so they had to use a different type of material when it comes to oil painting. So water is a vehicle used in several types of painting, and you'll find out that to use water as a vehicle just makes the overall painting a little bit more convenient. Makes it less work. So when artists use oil, they actually had to go a little bit further and purchase another material, and it's actually more toxic, so it's not exactly as safe to paint with turpentine in comparison to water. But anyhow, when it comes to the painting surface, they are always painted on a type of support. A support is the structure underneath the painting. Think of something like a canvas. So what I mean by canvas is basically a fabric that is used for a surface when it comes to painting. So when it comes to these types of support, they need to be sealed using a size or through sizing. So what sizing is, basically a liquid material that you put over the surface so that it can basically make a uniform surface and that there aren't really any holes where the pigment in the paint is just going to fall through. So the artist has to do a few things to prepare the surface before he or she actually starts painting. So the sizing is done, and also a primer. So the primer is used to create that help create a uniform surface. So if you can imagine, say that you are going to paint on a wooden panel. So you have like a wooden panel that you want to use as a type of frame for painting. So before you actually paint on it, you have to put a primer. So you're going to buy another material and you're going to basically apply this material on top so that when you actually apply when you actually apply the paint, then it'll be easier to see and it'll make more of a consistent surface. So these are important when it comes to creating paintings in general. And we're going to talk about different types of painting again. One of them is watercolor, one of the most basic ways to paint. For watercolor, pigments are mixed with water as a vehicle and gum arabic as the binder. The most common support for watercolor is a white rag paper. And what is neat about using white rag paper is that it doesn't require any sizing nor priming, so you can actually just paint right away. So watercolor is actually a very good medium when it comes to painting, especially if you just want to dive right into it. If you want to paint something like using oil or paint with acrylic, you actually had to put a little bit more work in preparing the surface. For watercolor, just get the right paper. You can start making work right away. So when it comes to watercolor, many of the artists use a type of staining technique. What staining is, basically painting using thin translucent washes. So imagine having the paint and that you have the color, and what artists do is they actually use quite a bit of the vehicle. They add a little bit more of the water, and then they'll just put a little bit of pigment. And with that pigment, they can actually cover a lot of area, and it'll be very thin. The application of paint is very thin. Highlights are obtained by leaving areas of the water paper unpainted. So for watercolor, not too many artists use white, or they don't really use too many colors to lighten up areas. They actually try to leave spots on the surface open for those highlights to occur. You'll see this term used a lot when it comes to describing paint, opaque. Opaque is when the color is non-translucent. In other words, you can't really see through it. So there's actually ways for artists to paint using any kind of medium. If they put enough color to where you can't really see through it anymore, it's called opaque. You, if you like, if you are painting and you want to see through it a little bit, then it's a little bit more translucent. And here's an example of a watercolor painting. Something that you'll notice with watercolor is many artists like to make and create these landscape types of paintings because of the nature, the natural tendencies of watercolor is very fluid, it's very light, and there's a lot of organic shapes. If you look at the watercolor painting we have here, especially with things like the ripples in the water and the expressive uses of shadows under the bridge, you can, in a way, see how the translucency of the watercolor is what makes the medium so unique from other types of media. And this is a work by John Singer Sargent, Rio de Santa Maria Formosa, Venice, made in 1905. Another type of watercolor is gouache. Gouache is a more opaque watercolor with a vehicle that includes fine chalk powder. So it is basically like watercolor, except there's a little bit of chalk in it. And because there's a little bit of that chalk powder, it makes the overall quality of paint a little bit more opaque. It's a little bit more, it's less translucent. So you can actually make a little bit more stronger areas of color opposed to watercolor where that can be a little bit more translucent. Gouache was commonly found in book illustrations during the Middle Ages. It's found a lot in traditional Persian art. Something about gouache, it's popular for ease of use and low cost. So if it comes down to painting and the artist, they don't want to spend too much money on pigments and materials, they'll probably go this direction with gouache. An example of gouache painting was seen from a previous chapter. Maybe you guys remember the work by Jacob Lawrence, Going Home from chapter 4. It is that image where they are in a subway and it's very abstract and there's a lot of really interesting patterns happening. And so I'm pretty sure there's another example of gouache in this textbook somewhere. And now we're going to jump into describing watercolor. An example of this can be seen through traditional Chinese watercolor works of art. There is a frequent use of black ink without color, even though color may be used. What is interesting about Chinese culture and Chinese art in general is that they believe that painting descended from calligraphy. And so what does that mean? Basically, when it comes down to the way we communicate, say that we as humans, we like to communicate through words, through our voice, and through our voice, we are able to generate something like text for words. So we need to, we can communicate through this way. We can communicate through writing. And so first came vocal communication, then came a communication through written word. From written word in China, they believe that they can express the language in a more stylized writing, which is calligraphy. And so one of the ultimate ways to communicate is through painting. So they believe that painting descended from calligraphy. And here is an example of a traditional watercolor painting, Zhang Daqian, Hidden Valley after Guo Shi, 1962. Very large watercolor painting. If you like these types of works, there's a very nice Asian art museum in San Francisco. I actually get to go there almost every year with some of my old professors in my old college at Fresno City College. And so I'm not sure if we're going to do that this year, but if you guys ever want to check out some really magnificent traditional works of Asian art, definitely check out San Francisco Asian Art Museum. Remember to check out some of these links on the modules page. They're very informative. And now we're going to jump into fresco or true fresco. You'll hear this word a lot. Buon fresco. So true fresco is when pigments are suspended in water applied to a damp lime plaster surface. So they're basically painting into a wall. I think the easiest way to remember fresco is that there are wall paintings. And something about buon fresco is that the plaster dries relatively quickly, so only a portion can be painted at a time. Usually they have to have the surface ready, whichever kind of surface it is, perhaps a wall. But before they finish completing the wall, say that they're going to end up covering it or sealing it somehow, they have to apply a type of lime material, a type of this lime mineral water, and while it is still wet, then they can apply these colors onto it before it fully dries. Okay, and so, yes, they're using lime because it forms these calcium crystals that chemically bind the pigment into the wall. So they have the wall prepared, they, in a way, plaster it with this, or they apply this lime water over it so that when they start to paint, it creates a type of chemical bond. When it comes to fresco paintings, it has to be on a durable surface, and it is best suited in drier climatic zones. It is better when it is used in a warmer region, because if it is too humid, then it'll just fade away relatively quickly. So a little bit more info on fresco. One of the disadvantages of it is there are no changes that can be made after the paint is applied to the plaster. So it's one of the more unforgiving mediums. After the plaster, after the lime is dried, basically you can't really paint. You have to restart again. You can't just simply paint over. If you paint over, you have to paint over the whole thing. So it's not really as convenient as other types of painting media. So something that I'm going to ask when it comes to the exam is learn some of the advantages or disadvantages of some of these different painting media. So it can take around 12 to 14 hours to paint 2 square yards. And when it comes to fresco, it's very ideal to use this method for large murals. So if there is a large wall, this is actually one of the better methods to use this style of painting, is to cover a large area. If you have ever eaten in maybe an Italian food restaurant, I think that there's some Mexican food restaurants that have large paintings inside the walls. Those are buon frescos. So I guess, try to keep that in mind. If you ever, have dinner with your family, you'll see a lot of frescoes in restaurants. pizza places. I know Olive Garden probably for sure has them. So keep that in mind. The Chicos. And so the paint that they are using is actually a type of tempera, which is egg based. And I'll tell you guys about that in just a bit. Here is an example of a buon fresco painting, a very large painting here. You can see how tall it is just from looking at the doorways and seeing the ceilings of this inner space. And this is a work by Diego Rivera, Detroit Industry, made in 1932. When it comes to fresco, it was very popular in Renaissance Italy. It was the favored medium for painting on church walls. One of the most famous fresco paintings is by Michelangelo, the Sistine Chapel. And you can say that it was very popular during the Renaissance, but after some development in terms of the way paintings were being made, this process was actually slowed down, and that there was a revival of making fresco paintings, and this started in Mexico during the 1920s. There was a lot of fresco paintings from the government because they supported the arts and it shows a lot on the public buildings. So the work that we just looked at, the Detroit Industry, is a blend of traditional and contemporary subject matter. In other words, when it comes to Diego Rivera's work in general, he likes to talk about the indigenous part of Mexico. You'll see things like the native Mexican livelihood, with their agricultural lifestyle, and then they will show images of what is happening at the time. So in Mexico, during the 1920s, there was, of course, a boom in terms of the Industrial Revolution. So what Diego Rivera does is he makes works that have a little bit of both, something from the past and also something from the present. And you'll find out a lot of contemporary artists do that. They like to make connections between the past and the present. And here is another work by Diego Rivera, Man at the Crossroads. Just as I mentioned earlier, he likes to combine images from the past and also from the present. Yes, and if we look at this work here, it feels more like the present, even though there are hints of the plant life in indigenous Mexico. This was a very controversial painting. One of the reasons why is you'll see, we are looking at the figure in the center, some really interesting iconography happening, especially with some of the plant and some of the scientific symbology is happening on the wings there. But if you look on the right side of the central figure, there is a man there that he looks like his hands are somewhat clasped. He's actually a dictator from Russia during the time of, I want to say, Vladimir Lenin, in that I feel that Diego Rivera is he was a very socially active artist. He likes to, voice his opinion in his artwork. And so something interesting about this piece here, Man at the Crossroads, it was commissioned to be built in New York City, in the Rockefeller Center, and that when they saw this painting, before it was complete, I want to say around 2/3 of its progress, people were seeing that this this Russian leader was on his painting, and that he was very controversial at the time. And so because of that, this mural was actually destroyed. And so what happened was they dismantled it and they actually rebuilt it in Mexico. And now we're going to talk about another type of painting, encaustic. Encaustic is when the painters are using hot beeswax. So beeswax is used as a binder and also the vehicle, known to ancient Greeks. It flourished in Egypt during the Roman colonization period, and we have an example of encaustic painting through these Fayum portraits, basically memorials to the deceased. When it comes to encaustic paintings, temperature control is necessary. And here is a portrait of a boy made using encaustic on wood. And so you can see this was made in between 100 and 150 CE. Something that you'll notice that when it comes to encaustic is the amount of clarity the artist can achieve using this medium. And this was made around almost 2,000 years ago, but there's a lot of really strong uses of color on it. Another painting medium is tempera. Tempera is a painting medium that uses egg yolk as a binder. It is mixed equally with pigment and thinned with water. When it comes to tempera paint, the quality is more on the matte side. In other words, it's not shiny, especially when it dries. So when it comes to tempera, they have to use gesso. Gesso is a type of sizing or a primer that is used, and it is very chalky. It is a water-based liquid. So before a tempera painting is created, it has to be gessoed first. Some of the advantages of using tempera paint is the ability to achieve sharp lines and precise details. So here is an example of a tempera painting. So it is one of the earlier paintings where artists can achieve a lot of precise detailing. So they can make their lines very thin. They can make them very straight, in opposition to something like watercolor, where the behavior of the materials is very different, and it's a lot more difficult to create straight lines using watercolor. And so tempera here, they can actually get better lines and shapes. Some of the disadvantages of using this medium, of using tempera, is that the colors often change while it's drying. So when the color is applied, it might look differently opposed to how it might look after it dries. It almost looks like it fades after it dries. So another disadvantage of tempera is that it is difficult to rework and it is not flexible. It usually requires a pale underpainting. Underpainting is basically painting underneath the actual painting first. Just think of a sketch, except that they're using paint. That's what an underpainting is. This painting is called The Story of Nastasio degli Onesti by Sandro Botticelli. Botticelli is an early Renaissance artist that we're going to talk about in a lot more detail in the future chapter. So hope you like this painting. I hope you enjoy Renaissance painting. We'll see more of that. And now we're going to talk about oil. Oil is the favored medium of Western art for 5 centuries. Linseed oil is the recipe that was perfected by 15th century Flemish artists. And here is an example of an oil painting here. So when it comes to this medium, you can say that right away, they are able to create a lot of detail, a lot of precise lines and precise colors. And you can see that the colors are a lot more saturated in comparison to the colors that we've seen in previous media. Tempera is a little bit on the paler side, and caustic is there's a little bit more saturation there, but when it comes to oil, they can make a lot of saturated colors. And you can see that, especially on the angel's wing on the upper right hand corner, and just how much of the richness of color that is found in just the fabric and on the figures here. A lot of variations from dark to light, but also using things like blue underneath the reds, and there's so many rich uses of color here. And this painting is by Jan van Eyck, Madonna and Child with the Chancellor Roland, made in 1433. So when it comes to oil painting, you'll see that artists use a lot of this glazed or transparent film of color. They like to apply colors in thin layers. That way they can get to the color that they really want. Very different way to paint in comparison to using something like watercolor or even a more direct painting. If you can remember from a previous chapter, we talked about Impressionism, just for maybe one slide, and that the artist was Berthe Morisot, and that she did a painting that was very loose, you know, like a Van Gogh style, where it is very painterly. When it comes to these artists during the Renaissance, they like to do everything in glazes. So basically very thin applications of color. That's the way they get so much accuracy and form. They're able to get so much, they can get very close to a photograph, basically. And some of the advantages of oil painting would include this idea that they can provide both increased opacity and, when thinned, greater transparency. So they can make the paint very opaque when they need to. They can make it very, very solid. But at the same time, they could apply very thin layers, very thin glazes. So it is very, very versatile as a painting medium. It's one of the most, if not, it is probably the most versatile painting medium. Another advantage of using oil is that it dries slowly. And sometimes you can look at this as a disadvantage as well. But overall, when it comes to making, works of art, if it slows the drying time, it actually gives the artist a little bit more control. You can make adjustments while it is still drying. So you can say that you can put a little bit of red on a canvas using oil paint, and that if you go back to it, say the next day, you can actually add a little bit more, you can add some green to it so that you can try to make it darker, and it won't be 100% until a little bit later. So the drying is a lot slower with oil. Sometimes it takes days, sometimes it takes weeks. Really depends on the artist and how much linseed oil they're using. So yes, oil, it dries slowly. And actually, for me as an artist, I like to use oil because I like that. I like that freedom of knowing that I can paint something and then I can look at it later and it won't be dry, so I can still add on to it to blend it even more. Another advantage of oil is that they are flexible. So it allows the use of canvases. So canvas I already talked about a lot. So just think of a type of fabric. And so when it comes to painting, doing oil painting on fabric, what is neat about that is, okay, you can imagine painting on a canvas, you're basically painting on a fabric, and say that you're doing an oil painting on this canvas, and if you're done, you can actually take it off of the support. You can take the canvas off of the support, and you can roll it, and then you can store it away. And because oil paint is very flexible, it's not gonna crack if you try to do that. Instead, it's it's very flexible, and you can store away paintings just by rolling them, and then storing them away. When it comes to oil painting, they can also use a impasto technique. In other words, using thick layers. And this is an example here. Tom Woodle, Rembrandt's Indulgence was Van Gogh's dilemma. So we have an interesting title here. Rembrandt is an artist known to be one of the master artists. And it seems like the artist is trying to play around with two styles of painting. One is more accurate, while the other is a little bit more on the expressive, the more impasto style of painting. Something about painting in general, they can do things like painting on wet. In other words, they can paint into the color while it's still wet, or you can just paint, wait till it dries and paint again. They call that wet on dry. So there's different ways to use oil paint. It's very versatile. Direct painting is when it can be completed at one sitting. Basically, suspending maybe 2 or 3 hours on a painting, and not really spending what normally artists would spend is weeks. They would normally spend weeks completing a painting. So direct painting is a lot faster. Indirect painting is when the artist takes a little bit more time and uses thin glazes. So there are so many different ways for artists to use painting as a medium. So there's another example here by Joan Mitchell. It is a little bit more on the spontaneous side, more on the abstract side as well. So this work that I'm about to show you is actually 2 canvases unified by colors chosen from 2 or 3 segments of the color wheel. It is an echo in composition, so let's check that out. The artist uses visual rhythm with quick, uniform brushstrokes. And so here is that example of the very, very abstract painting. And you can see that it is 2 paintings put together. You can see right in the middle, it's actually two pieces of canvas right next to each other. We call that a diptych. A diptych is when there are 2. It is basically one painting, but it is made from 2 pieces. There's also a triptych where there's one painting using 3 pieces. And this is a really large painting, actually. 102 inches by 157 inches, so very tall, very wide. But when it comes to using oil, you can say that it is one of the most versatile media when it comes to painting. And now we're going to talk about acrylic. Acrylic was invented during the mid-20th century. The binder for acrylic is acrylic polymer, which is a synthetic type of binder. In other words, it is man-made. Think of acrylic, or think of this acrylic polymer as a plastic type of material. The vehicle used in acrylic painting is water, so it is actually more convenient to use over turpentine. So turpentine is the vehicle used in oil painting. water is the vehicle in acrylic. When it comes to turpentine, it's toxic. It's very toxic. It's unhealthy to inhale for long periods of time. So that's one of the disadvantages of using oil. Even though there's a lot of alternatives that artists can use nowadays, like terpenoid. Anyhow, when because of this reason, because of water is the vehicle for acrylic, it just makes the process a little bit easier. When it comes to acrylic paint, they are relatively permanent paints. In other words, they last a very long time. They don't last as long as oil paints, but it's getting there. It's almost just as good. Something about acrylic paint is they dry very fast. So you can say that's an advantage, or you can say it's a disadvantage. I guess it all depends on the artist. So here's an example of an artist using acrylic paint and Truett Return. And you'll notice that this is more of a sculpture, more of an abstract sculpture. So you'll see a lot of artists, especially contemporary artists, using acrylic paint a lot. If they're not painting on canvas, if they're gonna paint on another type of material, they're probably almost 100% likely to use acrylic paint. So here's another example of oil painting. This has everything. Oh, well, not everything. Has a combination of different things. Kelty Ferris. Wow, very interesting title. Plus, 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 asterisk, 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 and parentheses or smiley face. 2012, oil, acrylic, and pastel on canvas. Very large abstract painting. And now we're going to talk about some contemporary approaches to painting. In other words, some of the more recent ways. Airbrush. Airbrushes are these small-scale paint sprayers capable of projecting fine, controlled mists of paint. And something interesting about airbrushes, maybe if you guys have ever been to the mall or you went shopping somewhere, there would be these vendors in the middle of the aisle where they can make shirts for you. And a lot of them can make their art on the spot, and they would actually do this using an airbrush. So if you can imagine, these airbrushes are basically imagine a pen, except that it sprays paint, and that you can actually push a little button on the pen to disperse the paint, and you can make it spread apart, or you can make it into a very thin line, but most of the time it spreads apart, so the color would have to be applied very closely if they were to make more precise lines. But because they can pull the airbrush back and cover area wider that way, they can actually control the amount of color that's landing on the surface. So you can actually do a lot of blending very easily using this medium. So there are no brush strokes when it comes to airbrushes. And again, you can do many gradations. You can blend very easily using this medium. Many graffiti artists like to use airbrush, but they also use things like spray cans. And they have to, because they want to be able to make works very quickly without getting caught, right? So many graffiti artists are using airbrushes and spray cans. So here is an example of a work of art actually using different types of media. Here, I actually see some digital painting, hints of brush strokes, and even photography. And this is by Jeremy Blake. The piece is called Sodium Fox. made in 2005. It's actually a still from a digital animation, 14-minute continuous loop. So it is actually a DVD collage combining film footage and stills with hand-painted elements. It has a dreamlike flow, unified by a poem. Very interesting. I had to look him up now. And so, that is it for the painting chapter. I hope that you guys learned a lot. Look forward to us discussing more different art media.